morning and welcome to another episode of Curated Conversations with me, Risa Hunter, the Assistant Director of Masterworks, and Elise Outerbridge, the Curator of Masterworks, and Tom Butterfield, the Founder and Executive Director of Masterworks. And Tom, I see you laughing.
Because the word episode becomes episodic. I just never thought about this in terms of being episodic. So,
great, good. So today we have a great topic to discuss, and one that I think we will all find interesting. We are talking about the homegrown female talent, those local female artists that have been in our collection for a number of years. And just talking a little bit more about who the artists were, you know, how they developed their artistic process and what legacy they leave behind. So I think I'll start off with a question, and Tom, you know, I'll go to you first, and Elise, feel free to chime in at any point. But starting with
just chime in early, okay?
Starting with those local female artists who really made a dent in Bermuda and the creative community in the early 1900s. Who would you say that those individuals were, and maybe highlight some of the key ones from our collection?
Well, you know, I'll leave the naming, because there are many of them, to Elise. I would like to say, however, that as the originator of the idea, as the originator of the hunter-gatherer, if you like, mentality, which is what we were doing starting in 1987. After acquiring the first 12 from overseas, locally people were jumping on the bandwagon and going to their attic and going to their basements and giving us what were considered by them, let's say, minor works. I mean, they were not Winslow Homer category, but nonetheless, they reflected a Bermuda, and they added to the credence and the notion of what we were doing, and that's what's important. What started to become apparent were the local artists at the turn of that century were all female. There were no male artists. And I was quite staggered by this. And so as we were going along, you start to reflect on how and why would this be happening? Were they Sunday school, artists? Were they just, practitioners passing some time? As it turns out, no, that's not the case. They were making sales at the time, selling them to visitors, and this is why we discovered some of them since overseas. But my theory is, and it really is only a theory, that probably the macho men at the time, who were also hunter-gatherers, were hunting and gathering whales and fish, and maybe even hogs that were running around the island at that time. That it was not seen as a gentleman's a pastime and or living, or for an income. And so that these women were representative, and the only representatives, of the early inspired works of the island by locals. There is not a male thus far to be found, with one exception, and that goes back to the early 1800s. And it's notable, but because he wasn't even a good artist, quite frankly. But he did nonetheless exist. But all the other females, one of them, a Bessie Gray, does stand out to me though, because one of the Bessie Grays that I found in New York is almost Homer-esque in its ability and in its message and in its execution of watercolor. It's a beautiful watercolor. And when I found it, I thought, right, this is a must-have to the collection. And she was the first of many that we found. And I guess at this point I would turn it over to Elise, because this is Elise's bailiwick to know who they are, find out and let the public know their names and what their contribution is.
Thanks, Tom. Well, in the history of art in Bermuda, women artists has been given kind of short shrift, but they shouldn't have, because the more we look into Bermuda art in its local form, the more we realize, as Tom said, that there were a number of Bermudian women who were very fine painters, including Bessie Gray and Louisa Marie Lightbourne, who actually went to Yale School of Art. She was one of the first female students there. And when she came back to Bermuda, her parents, she had an invalid sister, so she was relegated to taking care of her sister. Bessie Gray, on the other hand, was from a very prominent family. She was a Trimmingham. Her father was Brownlow Gray, and she did a lot of artwork. In fact, we just received from Armin and Jeremy Hartley just a while ago 2 beautiful paintings of flowers, which is a little unusual. I associate flowers and paintings with May Middleton, who was another really prolific Bermudian artist. But Armin and Jeremy gave us 2 beautiful paintings, one of a rose and one of a peony, which we've just gotten restored and hopefully have on exhibit soon. But Masterworks, as Tom said, has a history of really bringing some of these local artists, female artists, to the fore. Years ago, we did do a show called Ladies in Painting, which was, I'm not sure, Tom, what year that was. It was in the early 1990s, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, because the National Gallery had opened at that point.
Yeah, and it was very well received. At the time, the National Gallery did do one of the first shows of the Tucker sisters, Ethel and Catherine. Our friend Robin Trimmingham curated that show. So slowly in the 1990s, we became a little bit more aware of these female artists, although their family members have been holding them in high regard for years. Bessie Gray, Susanna Frith, who was the wife of a customs inspector in St. George's, did some lovely, almost primitive landscapes of Bermuda. Bessie did a lot of watercolors. Maria Lightbourne did oil paintings, some really interesting, almost spooky looking, one of Conyers Rock. And so the story goes. But these were all ladies who were mostly at home and were painting and were very talented. A lot of them, like Bessie Gray, didn't sell their work because I think financially she didn't need to, but donated them and listened to this, to a lot of charities as fundraisers in those days. So we find a lot of her paintings in Bermudian households. And of course, this leads us to the legacy that they put down in the 1900s. Most of these ladies were born around the Civil War or a little right before, so they came into their own sort of right after the Civil War, when people were, Bermuda was becoming a little bit more exposed to the outside world. With the case of Bessie Gray, we conjecture that she might have been taught by the famous American artist who was here during the Civil War, Edmund James. Somebody said that, but I find it hard to believe because I'm not sure how long he was here, but she would have only been about 12 or 15 at the time.
Not even.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's still a lot of research, a lot of work to do on these, but the legacy they leave, we can find, as we said, in the Tucker sisters, Catherine and Ethel, and in fact, the entire Tucker family, and Audrey Lang, Gwen Cann, Sharon Wilson. I don't even want to name names because the list is very long, and we need to do a lot more work to highlight some of these artists because they've been given kind of short shrift and been sitting in the shadows of their more famous male counterparts over the years.
I think, Risa and Elise, it's important in some way, if not somewhat ironic, to point out that while Masterworks started in 1987, a full 80 plus years after Bessie Gray was doing her landscapes, these are artists that were inspired by their environment. And that was the premise upon which the foundation got going. It was artwork that had inspired other artists. The irony being, of course, that these inspired local artists were probably hugely overlooked and completely ignored. As it turns out, many of the artists who visited the island were ignored because Bermuda, prior to World War II, had a very impoverished economy. There was not much money floating around. But it's the artists and certificate, because you keep in mind, the earliest works that we really have, and we've tried to embrace a fair representation of the island of Bermuda, so its physicality. So we have some early topographics that really just record the island, and we've got a map or two, but that is not the thrust of the collection. Ironically, too, are that Bermudians, prior to what we were doing, Bermudians themselves were collecting artworks that were mostly maps, or mostly some sailing scenes. They were not works that were fully inspired by the atmosphere and the environment of the island. And that's what's so important about resurrecting these forgotten Bermuda artists. Well, they're not forgotten now due to the work that we've done. But they were largely ignored. I mean, I had never heard really of anybody other than Mae Middleton, because she was a long distant relative of mine. But other than that, and there was a Mae Middleton at home that we all ignored for decades. Nobody had any clue that of the prolific work that she left behind.
Yeah, well, a lot of the work that was done by female artists in Bermuda were thought of as decorative art. I mean, as Tom says, Mae Middleton did beautiful florals. I mean, she did there's hundreds and hundreds, and they're just absolutely gorgeous. I mean, I don't know whether she took a class in floral art, but she really had a talent for it. And also, I keep on thinking that during the time that these ladies were painting, photography was in its fledgling form. I mean, photography was around, that's true, but it wasn't used the way it is today. And I think a lot of these paintings recorded what Bermuda looked like, at the time. A lot of the houses, a lot of the gardens in particular, landscapes of the waterfront. So it's kind of interesting what caught their fancy as they went out with their.
Good point, Elise. Good point. Because one of the most stunning photographs that we have is a hand-tinted black and white, circa 1915, done by somebody Watson. Isn't that right?
That's right.
Easter lilies with a jalousie or a blind. That has just been hand colored so magnificently. It's a marvelous example of the technique between photography and watercolor application over the black and white medium.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that we have in our collection that's kind of interesting is we have a number of notebooks. In those days, when people had more time on their hands, they had the ability to spend the afternoon, doing sketches of watercolors. And we have some dear little actual travel brochures, which they have been hand painted over the writing, and that sort of gives another wonderful picture of what Bermuda was like in those days. It was slow. The afternoons could be spent painting or reading, and it was a completely different environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, sounds very relaxing. I think what I find really interesting is that a lot of these women were self-taught, right? And they were obviously able to master their technique. I mean, Tom, you were just talking about that, and create these beautiful artworks. So Elise, maybe, is there any other information that we know of based on research that's out there about how they were able to learn at home, learn within the domestic sphere, and really, be on a playing field artistically as men at their time?
Well, as I said, Bessie Gray did attend Yale Art School, which at the time was really unusual, and obviously because of her financial means, she was able to. I have a feeling that Maria Louise Lightbourne was in the same kind of a category. If you were a Bermudian, whether you were white or black, and you were working on a farm, you didn't have a whole lot of time to do artwork, and it just wasn't looked at as something that was frivolous. Most of the work that we're talking about right now were done by women of a certain means that had the time during the day to pursue their hobbies. Nowadays, it's a lot different. We make time to do this kind of thing. From every walk of life, we make time to make art. We make time to make things beautiful. We make time to look at our surroundings. But in those days, people just didn't have the luxury of a lot of time to spend on doing this kind of thing.
I think, Risa, you raised an interesting issue, Risa, that there was no art school here, obviously. But when you have a talent, you have a talent. I mean, there are a lot of musicians that we can think of that are self-taught. There are a lot of dancers that are self-taught, and the list goes on. So if you have the sense of urgency to get watercolor to paper, it exists, and it's there, and it just flows off the pages naturally. So that I think too that's part of the glory of what we've been able to assemble and conveniently put together under one roof is that sense that people, taught through school or self-taught. They all fall under the umbrella of one collection.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't think that in the time that we're talking about, the Royal Gazette stationery store, DNA existed. So I know that Catherine and Ethel Tucker had to go overseas to England to get their paints in order to make both their watercolors and their oil paints. So I'm not sure whether there was access to, very high quality art supplies, which leads us to the fact that Bermuda is not very kind to artwork in the first place. And if the materials are inferior, chances are there might have been some really great works done by people who it just disintegrated. It breaks both Tom's and my heart sometimes to see the condition some artwork that's been sitting in Bermuda houses come in. And luckily we know a few good restorers that are able to bring them back to life. But there's many a time that we've seen things and it just disappoints family members because they're just not worth it. I mean, the paper was bad, the supplies were bad, and they were kept, exposed to the wormwood and the sun and the humidity. So it didn't bode well for Bermuda created artwork, in the early 17th, 19th centuries.
Yeah, and I think it's a challenge for all artists here in Bermuda, and I love hearing these stories because for me, I really love the spotlight that women get, every so often, and it needs to happen more as part of just the art historical canon globally, right? So Masterworks has obviously done a very good job of shedding light on those local artists, those female artists that need recognition. And I guess as we wrap up, is there any final words that you'd like to share in terms of their legacy or where you see us going with
Well,
this
there is definitely a
future?
chapter 2. I think of people like Gwen Cann. I think of people like Audrey Lang. I think of people like Lily Lang. I mean, the list of artists that emerged in Bermuda in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s is huge. And again, they're not always paid the recognition that sometimes they fully deserve.
I don't know whether Elise mentioned it or not, but in the case of Louise Leiparnay, who did go overseas, her legacy was shortcut because she had to look after an ill father. So very little of her work is around. Whether there's more than 2, I don't know. These are the sorts of things that will continue to be unearthed as people move on and pass down their artwork or pass it off or move it into our collection. So there's an unknown story for her. So the 2 works that we have are the only representations that I know of.
And also, I have a feeling that a lot of artwork, if it did start to disintegrate, people just threw it away. I mean, it wasn't thought of something of great value at the time, for a lot of people. So if it's old and disintegrated, it just, that was the way when I first came to Bermuda, people kind of thought. So, we don't know what disappeared.
Yeah. Well, sounds like, we're starting the conversation and the pair of you started the conversation when you really brought in these art pieces from these female artists. And so, their legacy lives on. We will continue to highlight female artists. It's something that I feel very passionate about as well. And, I'm excited to uncover, what other stories are out.
Ice Princess is frozen in time.